We have Ashish down with us. He's a WSDC champion and a former WDC World #1. I think that CV speaks for itself. No other competitions matter really. Cheers. Alright.
It's a lecture, it's no need to applaud, it's like a lesson. Okay, so basically what I'm going to cover, firstly just some general stuff on how to make principled arguments, then ethics, which is mostly about looking at utilitarianism versus alternatives, choice and coercion, and I'll spend most time on these three things. And then a couple of more specific things I want to get into, which is rights, political philosophy, criminal justice, and reparations. If we have time, we might get into Marxism, AI, and personal identity. Or you can just raise these things at Q&A and I'll see what I can do with them, right? But yes, okay, so one thing I want to point out before we get started is these things generally go a lot better if you ask me questions, and if I ask for a straw poll, what do people think about something, please try and respond, Don't do that very Singaporean thing where you just look at me and then it all gets really awkward. Yeah, so, okay, principled arguments, what are they, what do they do they do things, let's find out. Anyone watches BoJack Horseman, by the way? Yeah. Season 6 is coming out today, it's a big day. Okay. So, first of all, just to motivate this entire exercise, why do you make principled arguments? We don't use principled arguments in a debating community in a particularly consistent way, right? Because technically, almost all arguments you make about what's good or bad or right or wrong are principled arguments. It's just that we tend to agree that the default for evaluating what's good or bad, right or wrong, is just utilitarianism. So when we say principled arguments, we usually mean non-consequentialist arguments. So why do you want to make these arguments in debates? I think the first thing is that because these arguments are consequence-free, they bring a lot of clarity to debates, especially if you're on closing half, right? Often your opening half will have a long back and forth about efficiency, effects, and they'll have to do boring things like weigh things up. And if you have a nice principled argument, you can come in extension and say, in my extension, I just offer you clarity, basically, right? You can ignore everything which was said. This is something which should never be permitted under any circumstances, and here is why. So a principled argument lets you get away with ignoring a lot of what's happened in a debate if you manage to prove, which can be quite difficult sometimes. The second thing is that if you do manage to prove them, because everyone debates principled arguments so awfully, they're almost impossible to defeat, right? As you go through this, I'll give you some arguments and the rebuttals, but I can assure you that in 90% of debates where you make these arguments, you will never have to make the rebuttal because the other side just won't say anything in response. So you just win by saying, we said this thing and they didn't respond. A very good example is the Thes Finals, right? This House supports global Marxist revolution, where the opening government makes a fairly basic but well-explained argument of why capitalism is nasty, and then the opposition just entirely implodes because no one can rebut the argument that capitalism is kind of arbitrary. Two myths I want to get out of the way, and one kind of half warning before we get into the material. You always hear judges say that, some of your coaches might even say this, that the problem with principled arguments is that you can't really weigh them up, what's the impact of your principled argument? That's just incoherent, right? So if anyone tells you that, you can just write them off in your head as being bad judges or bad coaches. Because the whole point of principled arguments is that you don't have to weigh them up. Because weighing things up is a uniquely utilitarian sort of things to do, right? You look at the costs and the benefits, and then you weigh them up in some vague sense. If you prove that something is never permissible by a principle, the whole point is that you never have to get to the weighing up because that issue never arises. The second myth I want to get rid of is that people often say, you can make a principled argument, but make sure you also have a practical argument. Now that's often a good piece of advice if you're in the opening half of a debate. In the closing half of the debate, that's quite often bad advice. And it's often just simpler to run a detailed, good principled argument and win the debate on that basis. All of this assumes you can actually make the argument, right? Many people will tell you don't make principled arguments, but that's just because they either haven't made them or just are uncomfortable making them. Okay, so a couple of brief things to keep in mind. This is just general stuff in principled arguments. Firstly, this is very basic. Principled arguments are arguments. There's this slightly cynical point of view which is sort of going around. Only ever espoused by people who themselves never make principled arguments, weirdly enough. We say that, oh, there are no principled arguments, they're just observations, it's just words, it's just fluff, you know. You say something persuasively and you hope the judge buys it. It's true that observations and rhetoric are very important, but principled arguments are arguments in the exact same way that arguments about fiscal policy or arguments about, I don't know, efficiency, about intervention are. Think of them as ordinary arguments with premises and conclusions which you need to be rigorous about. The one difference between principal arguments and other kinds of arguments is that for principal arguments, you're usually trying to show the judge that they already believe in the thing you are trying to prove. So the trick of principal arguments is finding the right example or the right rhetoric or the right argument so that the judge goes, yeah, actually I kind of believe that already. That just sounds like an intuitive thing to say. And that a moral system which didn't take this into account would be a weird way to look at the world. The second thing is don't half-ass principled arguments, right? Very often I see teams, maybe they've heard somewhere that it's good to analogize something to slavery, and they'll give a speech, and somewhere in the speech they'll say something like, oh, and by the way, we also think this is just like slavery because it's just so dehumanizing. And my second point is, and then they move on. Like, they've just completely wasted their time, right? I would say the vast majority of the time, a principled argument is useless unless you spend something like 3 minutes on it, like really explaining it. If you think of all the great principled speeches you might have seen online, you notice that none of them make the arguments in a by the way sort of way. Like again, the Thessaloniki finals, it's just 7 continuous minutes of principled argumentation, right? If you've seen Sheng Wu's speech in the semi-final of Euros, the one about whether or not it's legitimate to, I think, like bomb religious sites in times of war, he doesn't say it as a by the way thing. He devotes a lot of time to actually explaining it. The problem is that most people have a kind of psychological barrier to doing that. Most people like principal arguments are kind of dangerous, so like I'll say it because like I heard about it in this lecture, it's cool for me to say it, and then I'll move on. Don't do that because you might as well not make the argument. Third thing, language matters, because again, you're trying to persuade the judge they already believe something, so you need to find the right language. And also because a lot of the analogies, a lot of the examples you will use fall totally flat unless you think hard about the kind of language you want to use. And the last thing is, you have to be at least a bit angry, or at least really funny when you make a principled argument, most of the time, right? So for instance, if you're making an argument of why we shouldn't torture terrorists, it doesn't really work for you to say, yeah, we shouldn't torture terrorists because people have dignity and we just don't want to undermine the dignity because it's bad. People have dignity, you need to move on. Like, no one's persuaded by that, right? But if you bang the table and you talk about how this is evil and dehumanizing and the government are just like unthinkably evil for even daring to propose something like that, it's just a lot more persuasive, right? So you actually do have to sort of experiment with this stuff and find what works for you. Okay, so let's get into the first substantive area. This is broadly called ethics, but really what I want to look at is looking at utilitarianism, which is the default way we tend to weigh up debates, and seeing if there are ways you can destabilize this framework to your advantage in a debate. Just take a seat anywhere, just hang around, yeah. Cool. So, but before that, and this next slide is the most technical slide in this entire presentation, so forgive me. Just to be clear on what morality actually is, right? Because I think there's some debates where this actually ends up being relevant. When we talk about morality, then there are many different definitions, but this is the one which is probably most useful for you if you're actually in a debate. Morality refers to irreducible and overriding normativity. Normativity just means something which tells you what you ought to do. Every time someone uses the word ought, they are being normative. What does it mean for normativity to be irreducible? So very often when we talk about things we ought to do, we can explain that by reference to another ought. Here's an obvious example. I ought to buy flour. Why? Because I ought to bake myself a cake. I ought to bake myself a cake because I ought to satiate my hunger, and I ought to satiate my hunger because I ought to care for myself, right? So notice that first ought, I should go to the supermarket and buy some food, can be reduced to another normative claim, which can be reduced to another normative claim, right? Moral claims are not like that. Moral claims can't be reduced to any other normative claim. If I tell you, you ought not murder someone because it's morally wrong, you cannot derive that ought from a deeper ought. You can derive it from other principles, other arguments, but not from other normative claims. That's the first kind of weird thing about moral claims. The second thing about moral claims, and this is probably what you're more familiar with, is that they are overriding. In other words, it always is a sort of weird, illogical thing to tell someone, morally you ought to do X, but really you ought to do Y. This sentence makes no sense. Because the moment you tell someone morally you ought to do X, nothing can override a moral norm. There is no higher ought which can override a moral norm. Whereas I could tell you, sure, if you want to stop feeling hungry, you ought to get a McDonald's meal, but really you shouldn't because it'll be bad for your health. That sentence makes complete sense, right? The ought in the first part of the sentence can be undermined by an ought in the second part, but you can't really do that with moral claims. And the reason why I want to say it helps you to be clear on what moral claims are is that some of the weirder debates about like AI or morality enhancement drugs, knowing what morality actually is will help you make good arguments about them. I think the example I would use is, most of my examples are from debates I was in or which I have watched. So I'm not trying to big myself up, just statistically sort of work out this way. So like in Malaysia Worlds, there was a debate about whether or not it's okay for the government to like research morality enhancement drugs, right? And we made the argument that this is basically, it's a kind of slavery, because when you modify your own moral metrics, you are modifying like the highest court of appeal you have in your brain when it comes to making decisions about yourself, right? Whenever you're making a decision, the deepest thing you can consult in yourself about why you ought to do something is going to be a moral claim, precisely because morality is irreducible and overriding. So unlike modifying your preferences for your clothes or who you hang out with, unlike any other preferences, your moral viewpoints are more fundamental than anything else. And so modifying those uniquely reduces the choice you have, and that's like something which we don't think people should be allowed to do. By the way, that was also a non-consequentialist argument. There's like no consequence to this argument whatsoever, apart from the fact that it's kind of like slavery, right? So it's a good example of why sort of being clear on the more technical aspects of ethics can help out in debates. So now that we've got the technical part out of the way, there's a huge number of debates which at some level are about utilitarianism versus something else. That something else, luckily enough, often is not a whole other moral theory. It often is just showing that utilitarianism has some gaps in it, and there's this other thing which we should take into account, which the sort of consequentialist case on the side of the prop, for instance, is not properly examining. So here are some very obvious ones, like torturing terrorists. One side will say we torture terrorists, we get information, we save lives. The other side will say we don't care if you save lives. Torturing is always prohibited, right? Similar for targeting civilians at war. Supporting global Marxist revolution, that's very straightforward, because one side is going to say people are going to die, the other side is going to say we don't care. Granting animals the same basic rights as humans is another classic example, because a utilitarian will say, because the only thing we care about is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, given that animals can feel pain and pleasure, they ought to have the same sorts of rights which people do. And one side is basically to say that pleasure and pain are not the fundamental currency of morality. Retribution has no place in the criminal justice system. Most utilitarians will say that retribution makes no sense because you're just hurting two people, so you're just increasing the net amount of suffering in the world. So to justify retribution, you often need to make a non-utilitarian argument. Selling yourself in slavery, people will say, maybe you get money, like maybe you're a really poor person, you need to feed yourself, so you sell yourself into slavery. The other side will say, it doesn't matter if you starve and die, you shouldn't be allowed to do it anyway. Moral enhancement drugs, just talked about that. Mass surveillance, pretty straightforward. And almost all reparations debates are about, if you're arguing for reparation, you're always taking a non-utilitarian stance. Almost always. The reason is that reparations are not about helping the worst off, who need government aid the most, which would be what an efficient utilitarian would want to do. Reparations are about redressing past wrongs, which are a different kind of moral thinking. So just to make the point that if you think carefully, you'll be able to apply this stuff in a very, very, very large number of debates. Okay, so these are like four sort of standard problems with utilitarianism. The first problem with utilitarianism, by the way, does anyone sort of know what utilitarianism means? Anyone's not clear what it is? Just a moral system which says only consequences matter, and the only specific kind of consequence which matters is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, right? There are different versions of utilitarianism. Some of them, instead of saying pleasure and pain, will say something like maximizing desire satisfaction. But it all boils down to like something very similar. So, first problem with utilitarianism, it does not respect the fact of human dignity. And the most common way in which this thought is expressed is sort of derived from what Kant said, which is that you should never use a human being purely as a means to an end. And utilitarianism permits that. There's a couple of standard thought experiments which are used to prove this. The most powerful thought experiment I know of, which is one you will need to use very carefully in debates, is what's called the harmless rape thought experiment. Anyone familiar with this, the concept of harmless rape? The person who came up with this is this guy called John Garner. Actually, his original article is very easy to read, so just look it up online. It's actually quite enjoyable. The thought experiment goes something like this. Suppose a man has sexual intercourse with a woman who is unconscious. She does not consent to this, obviously, so that's obviously rape. Suppose that the woman wakes up and she never remembers this. There is no physical harm to her whatsoever, and she goes about the rest of her life until she dies exactly as if this rape never happened. And suppose as well that this man never ever commits that crime again, and he never tells anyone about it and no one finds out, right? A utilitarian would look at this scenario and say, what's wrong? It's clearly fine. One guy got pleasure, and the woman didn't suffer pain. So this is clearly a morally permissible thing to do. It might even perversely might have been a morally good thing to do, given that he got pleasure out of it, right? The vast majority of sensible human beings would say that this is pretty fucked up, right? This is not just moral evil, it's one of the most profound moral evils you can do to someone else. And the reason it's a moral evil, it's not because someone suffered, but it's because the man used the woman purely as a means to an end. He used her as a vessel through which he tried to achieve sexual pleasure, right? And this is a very, very difficult thought experiment for utilitarians to answer. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm not sure I want to talk about rape in these sort of graphic terms in the debate, which is perfectly fair, right? You need to sort of be quite sensitive in the way you use this example. But I think that often when you think about these sorts of thought experiments, there's sort of more sensitive ways you can do it. So if you're not comfortable with that wording, you may want to say this instead. Like, if a public prosecutor was aware of a woman who was raped while she was unconscious and has no recollection of this, the public prosecutor most of the time would nonetheless go after the person who committed that rape because they recognize that a moral wrong has still been committed, right? So you can always frame this in slightly less abstract senses and make it a bit more practical if that helps. And like this is like a classic example of how sheer use is unjustified. Now, if you're going to be making a thought experiment like this, you can't just say the thought experiment and leave it there. There's always two other things you need to do for the thought experiment. You need to explain that a thought experiment shows what you want it to show, right? In other words, that sheer use of a human being is wrong. But then you also need to give, if you can, an abstract argument about why this moral thing actually really matters, right? And so, in this sort of Kantian example, I would actually encourage you to at least think about trying to make the Kantian argument, right? Make the argument for Kantian deontology. Don't actually make Kant's argument, because even Kant does not know what he's talking about. Like, he gives 4 different formulations of this categorical imperative, and none of them are equivalent. So he's got no idea what he's talking about. So I encourage you to use the formulation which this philosopher called Christine Korsgaard, Korsgaard, you can look it up. The formulation she uses is this. Imagine any outcome which you think is good, right? Like maximizing happiness, I don't know, maximizing bagels, anything, right? The question always arises, why is it that this particular outcome, this particular thing is good to begin with? And the answer Christine Korsgaard gives is that something is only good, not because it's desired, but because a human being has identified it as a good thing and willed it as a good thing. That they've actually chosen to actively make it a good thing in their lives. So the goodness of a thing does not come from the fact that it's desired. It comes from a deeper fact, which is the fact about human dignity and human autonomy, right? In other words, pleasure is only good because it's been given value by human dignity and human autonomy. And if the value of pleasure comes from human dignity and autonomy, then it never makes sense to undermine to ignore human dignity and autonomy in favor of maximizing pleasure, because pleasure is a secondary good. The fundamental good is being a human and the dignity which comes with it, right? And I think that's a fairly simple argument you can make in lots of debates. Now, you're thinking, all of this is very abstract, but again, if you think about it, there are many, many debates where you can use this, right? this house would use human shields in war. It's like a classic example because everything I said applies directly to that debate. Using someone as a human shield is like one of the best examples of using someone purely as a means to an end. Right? If you make an argument why it's never permissible, even if it saves lives, you just win debate straightforwardly. Same for debates about torture. Same for debates about chemical weapons, right? So yeah, I think just good to keep this in the back of your mind when you're sort of encountering these sorts of debates. There's sort of some creative applications as well for the maxim that you should never use people as a means to an end. So I think recently I did a debate, people who should remain unnamed, which is about like whether or not basically people should just stop having children, right? The human race to gradually go extinct. And if you think about it, given that children are unable to consent to anything done to them, and before the age of 2, they aren't even aware that they exist as separate beings from other people. They don't pass the mirror test, right? When they look at themselves in the mirror, they don't recognize it's them. You know, isn't every parent who decides to have a child just using that child exclusively as a means to an end, given that child is incapable of making choices or determining what's of value in lives on their own, right? So you can with a bit of creativity, you can find sort of weird situations where you can apply these sorts of arguments. You know, and if using someone as a means to an end is never allowed, then we should never be allowed to have children. So you can always think of fun stuff like this. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? The second problem with utilitarianism is it's often said that it ignores special relationships we have. Because under utilitarianism, my moral relation to every single human being is exactly the same. I don't have special obligations to my parents or my loved ones. I don't have special obligations to people who have helped me out in my life. I don't have special obligations to someone to whom I've made a promise, even if that person has relied on that promise or be hurt by me violating that promise, right? And people say this is a problem for utilitarianism. And if you need a thought experiment for this, I think one which can sometimes be used is sort of like the classic, the organ donor thought experiment, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, right? The thought experiment goes, if a patient goes to a clinic with a relatively mild disease, right? And the doctor or surgeon happens to have 4 people dying in rooms in the hospital who desperately need organ transplants. Let's say like a heart, or a liver can't go back, so I suppose you can't use that. Imagine 4 organs which if taken out of your body would kill you, right? A utilitarian would say the right thing for the doctor to do would be to tell this patient to just walk in the door, yeah, sure, I'll help you, I'll do all the nice things for you, but then murder the patient, steal their organs, and use it to save 4 lives, right? Now, obviously, one explanation for this thought experiment is what we just talked about, that this is using someone as a means to an end. Right? But there's a second explanation, which is that when someone comes to you and asks you for help, and you agree to help them, and they put themselves in a specifically vulnerable position vis-a-vis you, like they agree to be, I don't know, like put under general anesthetic, for instance, you end up owing special obligations to that person by virtue of the fact that you put them in that vulnerable situation in the first place, or because you made an implied promise to them, right? And that's another explanation for the thought experiment. So you can sort of talk about this as well. Again, this might be relevant for debates about whether or not you let in immigrants, right? You might want to say the government has a special relationship to its own citizens, which it does not owe to other people around the world, even if these other people are suffering greatly, and would be, net happiness and would be increased if we help them more. The third problem with utilitarianism is that it does not distinguish between experience and meaning. It's a kind of a hard concept to get at, but the idea is that utilitarianism values fake experiences as much as it does real ones. I think like a sort of a canonical example thought experiment is the one which Robert Nozick came up with. You might have heard of it, N-O-Z-I-C-K. His famous thought experiment was the experience machine, right? Imagine we invent a machine which if you plug yourself into it would create basically this kind of virtual utopia in which you live out the rest of your life. And Nozick says that most people will not plug themselves into an experience machine because even if they experience happiness, it's meaningless happiness, it's fake happiness. It does not correspond to anything which is genuinely meaningful in the real world. And the moral intuition underlying this is that happiness is not in itself valuable. Happiness is just a byproduct of real things which are valuable. And the real things which are valuable are things like friendship, are things like loyalty, right? Are things like aesthetic appreciation, right? Are things like self-development. And these are the things which are intrinsically good, and happiness merely accompanies these things. So if you take away these things, and all that's left is happiness, none of them are intrinsically valuable. And Nozick actually says that plugging yourself into the experience machine wouldn't just be wrong, it would be a kind of suicide. And actually, they have done some sort of like statistical surveys of people, and it turns out actually most people wouldn't plug themselves into the sort of experience machine. Although that's contested, because it turns out if you tell people, suppose you're living in the experience machine now, would you want to plug yourself out, like a matrix type situation, most people also wouldn't want to unplug themselves. So maybe all of this shows that people have a status quo bias. They just want to be where they are right now. Whatever. I think maybe another thought experiment which might get at the weirdness of this aspect of utilitarianism is like, the Truman Show? Like, suppose there's a professor at the university he's 50 years old and he's lived a really happy life, right? He is professionally successful, his children love and admire him, he's in a very fulfilling, committed relationship with his wife, his professional colleagues look up to him, and his students tell him what a great professor he is, right? This seems like a very nice life. Suppose that actually his wife thinks very little of him, and that actually she has very little love for him, and that she's in an adulterous relationship, and his children are ashamed of him, and and suppose that all his students actually just humor him because he's going to give them grades, but they don't actually admire him. And suppose that all of his professional colleagues think he's a has-been whose best work was done when he was in his early 30s, and ever since he got to New York, he's just a waste of oxygen and money, right? Now, if this guy finds out, if this professor finds out that all of these devastating facts about his life, he would be shattered, right? He'd be really sad. Now, a utilitarian would think that his sadness is irrational. Because a utilitarian would say, well, it doesn't matter that everyone is just faking, because the happiness you experienced in the past was real, wasn't it? And all that matters is the actual happiness. But it seems to be something really kind of fucked up. We're telling this person that it doesn't matter that all of it was fake, right? And most of you, if you were in that situation, probably would not agree with the utilitarian that this is fine. Right? You probably think this is a really awful thing, that your life has been drained of meaning and substance as a result of revelation. So it seems that there is a real sense in which we want to actually experience real good things in the real world as opposed to just the happiness which might happen to accompany these things, right? And like, if you looked at a list of motions which I flashed up earlier, I think you'll find, if you go through them yourself, you'll find that there are ways in which you can employ these arguments in them. Some of them are more commonly used than others. I think the one about dignity is by far and away the commonest one to use. But yeah, the others might be relevant too. So a general note on thought experiments, if you're going to use a thought experiment, again, don't just say it in 30 seconds and leave it be. You have to really explain why the thought experiment proves the one thing you wanted to show, and why there's a general moral theory backing up the outcome which a thought experiment has. Also, by the way, thought experiments are very useful for POIs. Right? Because suppose one side is making it's a debate, and one side is making like a brilliant consequentialist argument, like they have like tons of benefits just being racked up on their side, and you don't think there's a way you can realistically disprove all of those practical benefits. It can be very helpful to just offer POI and say, in this situation, would you do X? And if it's a good thought experiment, usually the person will say, we probably wouldn't, right? And that gives you an opening. In your next speech, you come and say, fine, they have acknowledged there's an entire dimension to this debate they have completely neglected. And that's a dimension to the debate which is not about consequences, but about what is the right way to treat human beings in the first place. And this is a question which is more fundamental, which comes prior to all of the consequential stuff. Like, I'll give you some rebuttal on that, but I'm going to first show you, Mr. Speaker, that have completely ignored an important dimension of the debate. And immediately you've got your foot in the door, right? Immediately you have made the debate a lot harder for the other side. So I think the example about like the doctor, for instance, right, whether or not you murder someone for their organs is a great POI to give because it's very easy to explain. People are kind of familiar with it, so even if you don't do a great job, people understand it, and it's easy for you to follow up on it. Don't ask one of these things and then don't follow up on it, obviously, because that's just a waste of time. Okay, any questions at this point? Fairly straightforward. Okay, cool. Now, how do you actually argue for utilitarianism? Now, like, in total honesty, I am myself pretty root preference utilitarian. So the problem I always have with utilitarianism is that it's so obviously correct that, how do you even make an argument for it? Actually, probably since we're in Asia, probably everyone's default moral metric is utilitarianism. So yeah, the two strong intuitions in favor of utilitarianism. And the first is that what really fundamentally matters in our lives, what makes our lives go well, is the amount of happiness or desired satisfaction we have with them, right? And I don't think this is too hard to prove. Most people, most judges will explain this if you just assert it kind of persuasively. The second strong intuition for utilitarianism is the idea that we should not make arbitrary distinctions between persons. And the way I think I would explain this in a debate is this. If what matters to me in my life is my pleasure and the satisfaction of my preferences, why should I only care about my preferences and my desires as opposed to everyone else's? Isn't it arbitrary and random that my preferences happen to reside in this brain and in this body? And if it really is that arbitrary, why should I not treat every single human being's preferences exactly as if they mattered as much as my own? But if I did that, I would basically be trying to maximize preference satisfaction in the world. And that would make me a preference satisfaction utilitarian, right? And this is the same intuition which is captured by things like the golden rule, right? You would do unto others as you have them do unto you, right? It's the idea that you should have proper regard for the interests and welfare of other people. And part of that means taking the interests seriously in a robust moral sense, right? I think that's like the proper abstract argument for utilitarianism. If you want to look up the actual argument for it, I think like, this guy writes pretty badly. He's really boring, right? If you want to look him up, this guy called Henry Sidgwick, Sidgwick, makes an argument which basically tracks this very closely. But he's quite boring to read, yeah. So I wouldn't recommend it. Or you could look up this guy called Hassani, Harsani, in free time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you can talk about how utilitarianism is just a good way to get stuff done. Basically, you say, look, there are lots of people in society, they all want different things. We got to hurt some people and help some people. We need some metric to weigh up these harms and benefits. And the great strength of utilitarianism is that it reduces all moral questions to discounting, basically, right? Then there are no deep principles. There's very little meta-ethical fluff in your moral theory. It's all just arithmetic. And of course, you need to find a way to deal with the previous thought experiments, which we discussed. I don't have that much time, so I'm just going to skip this bit. You can ask me questions about how to deal with them later. It can get a bit complicated, right? Okay, cool. At this point, apart from what I just said, any questions on utilitarianism, arguments for, arguments against thought experiments? Any of the thought experiments unclear? I think they all should be fairly clear. Great. Okay. General note on principal clashes. Only theories to resolve them. One, the principle does not exist. For example, one side says utilitarianism is correct, the other side says it's wrong, right? Another way is to say my principle trumps your principle. For example, as a general principle, we ought to punish bad people. However, everyone has an absolute right not to be tortured, so we cannot torture people, right? And then the third one is what most debates tend to be about, right? Debates within utilitarianism about the best outcome, right? Cool. So for instance, principles of risk aversion versus principles of risk taking, right? Usually the implied ethical framework you're using to evaluate these sorts of decisions is something like maximizing good outcomes, and you're just debating about which side actually applies the utilitarian metric a bit more robustly. Okay, straightforward. I put very little stuff down on my slides, sorry, so you take notes. Sorry, I did this like this morning. It's been a long day. Yeah, so okay, cool. So choice. So choice is a kind of weirdly debated. I'm sure you've heard people say some very strange things, right? Like, sure, you're giving people a choice, but this is a coerced choice. Which, if you think about it, makes no sense, because it's like, before you had 3 options. My policy gives you a 4th option, and that somehow is coercive, right? And so it's very hard sometimes to properly argue for why something really is coercive, or there's a problem in the way people are making choices, without properly thinking about what choice really means, or what a free choice, or what a dignified choice, or what a meaningful choice really means. So this section is just trying to pass those different concepts out a bit. Okay, so for instance, right, this house supports sweatshops. One side will say, but previously they had no jobs. Now they have jobs, so they won't die. And the other side says, but they will be coerced by the companies into joining these horrible jobs, right? Similarly, allowing prisoners to volunteer for drug trials. You're giving them an option, which they might actually take on, and which might make their lives better, but is even giving people this choice something which should be allowing people to do? And same for the last one. By the way, that second debate is another great debate where we can talk about, you know, not using people as a means to an end, right? So you see that this will keep recurring. But this debate is a bit more tricky because the other side will say, but you aren't using people as a means to an end because the prisoners consent. So it boils back down to the idea of whether or not there was a dignified choice given, right? So you can see how like different principal considerations can sort of end up chaining together in debates. So just to give you like a rough heuristic which might be helpful, like there's sort of 4 models of free choice. The first is the naive model, which says that choice exists in its fullest form when you have more than one option, right? And so in the examples I've just been giving have sort of used this notion, right? Like how can allowing for companies to create sweatshops be coercive when previously they had 3 options, now you're giving them a 4th? The sphere of their choice is expanded. And I call that a naive model, but actually it's a really powerful model. Like, you will not believe the number of debates you will win when the other side says, oh, this is coerced, and you go, how can it be coerced when I'm increasing the amount of options they have? If you think this is coercive, surely your world by definition must be more coercive because they had a smaller number of options, and people would rather be in my world than in your world. So whatever you're accusing our world of having, there's more of that bad thing in your world, right? And actually, you'll find that most teams will just be like, yeah, okay, I guess we're just gonna make practical arguments about why this is good for economic development and some jazz like that, right? So I call it naive, which usually academics use as sort of pejorative term, but actually, this is a valid model of choice and you should use it sometime. The second one is like the default model, what most debaters tend to use, which is the naive model plus a condition about rational choice. Right? That in some sense, for a choice to be something which the state respects, or for another moral actor in society to respect, your agency as a human being must be engaged in a choice in a meaningful way, right? And in order for that to happen, you need to adhere by certain basic principles of rationality. I don't think there's very much need to explain this. I think most of you probably know what this means. But one thing I would advise is just kind of have at the back of your head a whole list of standard cognitive biases which you can whip out. And you will find that it's often very hard for a team to show that either cognitive biases don't exist or that they don't matter enough to really undermine your choice. Like, okay, so any examples of standard cognitive biases which people know?
Racism.
Sorry?
Racism.
Yeah, racism, very common cognitive bias. Can you reduce racism to a deeper cognitive bias?
Fear of the unknown.
Yeah, I think it's probably something like that, right? Like fear of things which are unfamiliar. It's like one of the most powerful cognitive devices. The inverse of that is what they often sometimes call proximity bias. Those things which are closer to us and which we can more easily imagine, we tend to weight more than things which we cannot imagine. Very simple example. You probably know, like, you know, if your parents know of relatives who have been in a car accident, they'll suddenly start driving a lot more carefully. Not because it's rational to do, right? But because that example weighs more heavily in their decision-making process because they know someone who's been through it. Horizon effect often is just an effect of, is a subset of proximity bias, right? Because those circumstances in which we are presently living are obviously more real to us than probabilistic and distant circumstances. So we tend to, you know, make decisions which underweight consequences, negative consequences in the long term. And there are hundreds of debates where you'll need to use this, obviously, right? So proximity bias is sort of one standard one. Any other examples of bias which people sort of know of? Sexism, yeah. But again, like try and reduce it to something more, like a bit more abstract, right? Because the reason why I want you to reduce it to something more abstract, because in a debate about sexism, you don't need to prove that sexism exists because of cognitive biases. You would just say, Judge, sexism exists, here's how we solve it, right? But there's some debates where we need to prove that actually people's thinking break down in certain ways, right? So using something more abstract helps. Yeah, I think
risk aversion, indicators of response of risk aversion.
yeah, risk aversion. Like sometimes people are too risk averse. That's quite a common one as well. I think one very powerful one is like anchoring bias, right? Where we evaluate choices not by reference to whether or not they are in the abstract good or bad for us, but by reference to information which we were given beforehand, which anchors that information. So like a very classic example is like, if you were trying to buy like a washing machine, right, which costs $100, and you were told that if you take a cab ride which costs $20, you could go to a store which is selling the washing machine at a discount of $50. I think most of you would be like, yeah, I would take that cab ride which costs $15 and buy the washing machine with $50 discount and save like whatever, right? Like save $35, right? So like that time and effort invested is worth your $35. But if you were buying a car and someone offered a 50% discount on a car, would you like take a cab and go to somewhere in order to negotiate a 50% discount on a car? Most people wouldn't, because they're not evaluating that $50 discount by reference to what $50 actually means. They're comparing that $50 to the cost of the washing machine, which looks like a big discount for a washing machine, but looks like a tiny discount for a car. So people will go out of their way to get a 50% discount for a washing machine, but not for a car. Now that's just irrational. Makes no sense, because $50 is still $50, so just save $50 out of the way, right? And lots of companies do, like when they do discounts, right, they do stuff like this. Right? They will inflate the price of the thing and say, we're now offering this thing for like a 30% discount if you buy a whole year's worth of subscription of The Economist or something like that. Right, so, yeah, so proximity bias, anchoring, confirmation bias is one which often pops up in like debates about politics, right? Because people don't go outside of the bubbles because they feel much more comfortable staying in the one thing they're in, and even if they venture outside, they selectively remember those things which support their side. So these are like the simpler models of choice. Now there are two other models of choice, and these models of choice kind of explain why it's possible to give someone more options while at the same time that choice not being something which we ought to respect or subject people to. The first is the notion of an unfair choice. And I think a good thought experiment to get at the idea of what an intrinsically unfair choice is this. Like, suppose you're walking by like a lake and there's a man who's drowning in it, and the man is like screaming for you to help them, right? We would think there is something really fucked up if we were to tell that man, sure, I'll save you, but you're gonna promise me you're gonna pay me $50 if I jump in and save you. Right? Like, on one hand, you're offering that person a very straightforward choice. Either you die, or you live and pay me a bit of money. And you're certainly increasing that person's options, because previously they only had one option, which is to die, right? But what is wrong about offering a person a choice in this way, right? And what's wrong about the choice, if you think hard about it, it's the idea that we just ought to treat people in terrible situations a bit better. That we ought to respect their well-being. We ought to treat the ends as intrinsically meaningful a bit better. So if you think about it, again, it kind of boils down to the Kantian intuition, right? You shouldn't be using people in this way. And if you think about it, this could, if I was in a debate about sweatshops, I would certainly use this example. I'll say, sure, you're giving people more choice, but you're giving people choice in the exact same way I've given this drowning man choice. And there's something morally not okay about that, right? So that's the idea of an intrinsically unfair choice. Something which looks very similar to an unfair choice, but is different, is the idea of a manipulated choice. And this kind of it sort of links back to a quite Marxist concept that you're not truly free unless you can choose the circumstances in which you made your choice, right? So the standard thought experiment for this is like if a robber walks up to you and puts a gun to your head and says your money or your life. Again, they're giving you choices, right? It's very easy to rationally weigh which choice it is. So on the naive model or on the default model, there's nothing perverse about the choice, right? But the reason we can say there's something wrong about it is because the robber has deliberately engineered a situation in which you will obviously go for one choice over the other. And that choice is one which benefits them. So if you want to strengthen the argument from unfairness, you can say something like, not only is this bad for people intrinsically because they're in a bad situation, but the capitalist mechanisms of the state have conspired to create an underclass to whom we are now offering these invidious choices. So in exactly the same way a robber puts a gun to your head and saying your money or your life is perverse, the state going to poor people and say, except there being no minimum wage, is also perverse, right? And so I think it's just differentiating these different kinds of choices will help you respond to a team which says this is a valid choice by sort of saying it's problematic in various ways. Hi, Sherms.
Hello.
Wonderful of you to speak here. Sorry, I need to
Your fan club is bullying. You can be a politician.
I cannot imagine anything more. It actually makes me want to die more. But yeah, so okay, so choice. Any questions about choice? If you have so for instance, if you had debates where you struggled making a particular principle argument, I'm happy to sort of hear those particular examples out as well, if they'd be helpful. Okay, right, so hopefully, yes, sorry. Yes.
I would like to know, how do you compare that to the status quo that exists? So if you're saying that the choice that they're offering is manipulative or unfair,
Yeah.
why is it better than offering them no alternatives?
Right, so what you do in this situation is that you would say, we are also going to give them an extra choice. It's just one which isn't manipulative and unfair. In a vast majority of these debates, you wouldn't just presumably let the poor language in poverty, right? You have some kind of counter model, so that question usually does not arise. But even if you concede that you are giving them fewer options, you can always use this to mitigate the claim they're making that they're giving people more choice, right? You can say, sure, there are fewer options in our world, and that is genuinely unfortunate, but to say that the option you are giving them ought to be counted as a morally legitimate and okay thing to do to people is wrong as well, right? So at the very least, you can use it to significantly mitigate the sort of the choice argument they give, right? Yeah. Okay, right. Hopefully the next two slides will contradict many things which you have been told, because the next two slides are just intellectual hygiene, right? Because these things are really aggravating for me personally. Sorry if I sound a bit aggrieved. I have nothing against any of you personally. Rights are not things we like. Something is not a right just because it's nice for people to have it. Not even because it's very important for people to have it. Not even because it's going to make the world a much better place. That's nothing to do with why we give people rights. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is this. You know how in debates you often hear people saying, Judge, sure, we think people have this right, but as we all know, rights are not absolute. We need to weigh rights against other things. That is like saying circles are not round, right? That is a literally nonsensical string of words to utter, right? The reason is because rights are designed to be anti-utilitarian. The whole point of a right is to prevent a government or another person from undermining your interests in order to maximize social benefit. Right, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But if all you take away are these two things, I will be a marginally happier man some of the time. Oh wow, that's so all the things you take away. Sorry. Oh, it's back, it's fine, great. Right, so okay, now having said those things very dramatically, I'm going to caveat this slightly. And that the two things I just said refer to real rights, what we sometimes call fundamental rights or moral rights, right? There are three kinds of rights by and large. First category is what we just talked about, real rights. We'll get to those in a moment. Second category is what we call civil or political rights. These are legal permissions or powers which we give people so that we can have functioning democracies. So for instance, the right to vote, right? Or the right to participate in civil discourse, or the right to freely associate, right? These things, I don't think most people would regard these things as really fundamental rights, because if I took those away from you, nothing would really change about your life. But we need those things in order for us to have a democracy. Now, you can argue that these things are fundamental rights by saying you have a fundamental right to a democracy and you need these things for democracy. But at first blush, civil or political rights are not fundamental rights, and many debates are about that. The third category is a meaningless category. It's the category most governments and UN organizations use. It's legal permissions. Like, I have a right to cross the road. I have a right to wear the things I want to wear. I have a right to, I don't know, whatever, right? Anything which you're legally allowed to do is a legal right. So many EU directives are about like a right to disappear, those sorts of things. Those are just legal rights. So you will never ever really appeal to the third category, but you will appeal to the first two categories. There's a cross-cutting categorization of rights, which cuts across all three of these things. So all three of these things can have some of each kind, which are, and this distinction refers to claim rights versus liberty rights. A claim right protects a fundamental interest in a thing. Right? So something which you would think of as a claim right is something like a right to an education. we would say that children have a right to an education, even though children can't really make choices for themselves. They have a right to education just because education is good for them. You could say the right to life is that kind of a claim right as well. You could. It's not clear. The second thing is a liberty right. A liberty right is not about interests. It's about protecting your right to make decisions in certain areas of life. So for instance, the right to free speech is obviously not a claim right. Because the right to free speech does not say that you need to talk all the time. It's nonsensical, right? But the right to free speech says that you have the right to exercise your speech as you would like to, right? And if you believe that the right to life is a liberty right, not a claim right, then euthanasia makes sense. Because the right to life is not about protecting this thing which is fundamental to you, it's about giving you a protected sphere of conduct, a protected sphere of choice, where the way you dispose of or use your life is up for you to use. The reason why this distinction is helpful because it's often said that claim rights require you to create obligations and burdens on other people. Right? For instance, if I have a right to an education, someone needs to pay for it. Whereas a liberty right doesn't. A liberty right just requires people not to interfere with what you want to do. I mean, the distinction is a lot less sharp than I've just said it. I've just made it out to be, of course, right? Because even protecting a sphere of conduct, protecting liberty still requires states to invest quite a large amount of resources into, at minimum, protecting you from the attempts of other individuals to interfere in your exercise of those liberty rights. But the reason I'm talking about it's good to keep this distinction in mind is because in many debates, there is both a claim right type argument and a liberty right type argument. So many debates about whether or not we should have quotas in parliament, for instance, have an element of both of these things, right? Actually, Will Jones has a lecture online where he uses this exact example. I think it's a phenomenal example. If the debate was this house would have quotas for women in parliament, you can make one argument about claim rights, which is that there are many fundamental goods which women deserve to have in society which do not exist because you can't pass the right sorts of laws, and having quotas for women would let us pass the right sorts of laws. Like getting rid of tampon taxes, creating more maternity and paternity leave, right? Creating more stringent definitions of what counts as spousal abuse, updating evidentiary standards. Like, women have claim rights to laws which protect their interests in these ways, and having a quota for women will allow us to get all of these things, right? But there's also a liberty right, or a liberty type claim in this debate, which is that every person in society has an equal right, every person in society has a right to equal participation in a political system. And because of all the biases against women entering politics, they do not have an equal participation, and quotas give you that sort of equal participation, right? So even if you don't use these categories, just thinking in these lines, along these lines can be very helpful for like precisely delineating the sort of principal claims you want to make. So this is just like a taxonomy of rights, right? So I said that the first class of rights is the most important one, and that they're absolute. So let's talk a bit more about those. Okay, so real rights are counter-utilitarian or anti-consequentialist. Ronald Dworkin, DWORKIN, calls them trumps. Nozick calls them side constraints, right? And real rights, they cannot be modified, they cannot be traded off, weighted, restricted, or removed, right? And I think before we go into explaining why this is the case, I think it's good to just get an intuitive sense of what a right actually does in a debate, right? A rights claim carries with it a sense of, hitherto thou shalt come but no further, right? Is that, sure, maybe you could win a war faster with human shields. Maybe you could win a war faster by bombing this hospital. But we do not care, right? So long as there's one person in there, you shall not do this. And we don't care if the world goes to shit as a result, right? That rights claim have this sort of inherent anti-government anger seething beneath the surface, right? So if you want to make these sorts of arguments, it's helpful to adopt an attitude. They're extremely rare, because if you think about it, almost all rights have exceptions. Many people will say, at first blush, that would you say that the right to life is fundamental? Okay, so you're allowed to either put up your hands for this one or the next one, right? So people who think that the right to life is fundamental, put up your hand, like raise your hand. Okay.
Small number.
Right to life, fundamental? Yes, no? Okay. Sorry? I'm first saying yes. Like, if you think the right to life is fundamental, like, can I see your hands go up? Yeah, I think that's like what most people. Who thinks it's not fundamental, like the right to life? Yeah, you're right. It's under this definition, it's not fundamental because clearly we're allowed to kill people under all sorts of circumstances. Like we're going to fight wars, so clearly that can't be a fundamental right. Even though in every debate, people are like fundamental rights, like life or like bodily integrity. No, clearly, like we shoot people. Like so. Can anyone think of a right which could plausibly be said to really be absolute? Like you could really say there's no exception to this right ever? There are some.
Existence?
Yeah.
Property to yourself.
Self-ownership?
Yeah.
But we incarcerate people all the time. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's one of the very few rights which are so anti-majoritarian. Everyone kind of admits, yes, if it is about the right to self-defense, you know, utilitarian considerations sort of have to like step aside, right? Yeah.
Intellectual freedom.
Intellectual freedom. Ooh. Yeah, maybe the right to like freedom of thought in some sense is absolute. Yeah. But that's kind of an easy case, right? Because it all happens in your head. Right? So I could just say, yeah, sure, you have a right to think whatever you want, just no right to ever express or act on that. Any other rights we can think of as fundamental? I think the right to self-defense is like one of the big classic examples. Any other? I think there are like maybe 2 or 3 more. Torture, right to freedom from torture. That's one of the ones which you can at least plausibly argue is absolute, right? A right not to be subject to slavery, right? I mean, very often you hear people in debate saying, we wouldn't allow yourself to sell yourself into slavery, right? This is something similar to that. And maybe a bit more abstract, maybe like a right not to be subject to arbitrary discrimination, right? And so like, I can't think of any more apart from these. And even though they're very rare, if you think about it, absolute rights are very good to analogize to. The reason why is that if you can show that something is like an absolute right, and you can really prove that something is like self-defense, or that doing something to someone is like torture, and you manage to prove that these things are really absolute rights, you kind of win the debate by default, right? Because the other side can say, but the world will burn and everyone will die, and you can say, sure, but this is the right to self-defense. We should allow the world to burn. We don't care, right? So let me give you like, okay, let's go into how you can prove they exist. Okay, so the general argument for why things are fundamental rights is because they are necessary for you to be regarded as minimally human in the first place. So a good test for whether or not something is right is just ask, if we violated this consistently, would you still be recognizably human? Would we look at you and say, this is something which is in some sense malformed, right? Which has been so stripped of fundamental parts and attachments of humanity that we don't consider them human. You know, plausibly someone who's continuously subject to torture, or someone who's a mere slave, right? Again, see the Kantian arguments, is not meaningfully human, right? But that last line there is just sort of a get out clause, right? If you can't prove they're absolute, that's fine. Because there's always a trick you can do. You can always say, because if a judge just wants to weigh up unspecified quantities of stuff, because they're in love with weighing, as if that's something which intrinsically matters, which many judges are, unfortunately, you can always say, Madam Chair, yes, we acknowledge that no rights are absolute, and this right's not absolute either. But what we do say is that there's a very high threshold of very clear, overwhelming utilitarian benefit you gotta meet before you can override this right. So instead of using it as an absolute claim, you can do something a bit less, which is just use it to set a particularly high bar for when we can violate the fundamental interests of someone else, right? Cool, so how do you actually argue for rights, real or otherwise? Everyone clear so far on this slide? Any questions? Yeah.
Could you say, like the 2016 First World speech is just the right to self-defense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right, yeah. I'm actually going to talk about this in the next slide, about how I think the right to self-defense was very glancingly raised in, I think, the DPM speech. with a specific example, which we're about to get into. But you can do it in a much more, I think, fun way, right? Anyway, cool. So how do you argue for rights? Yes, certainly.
I was going to ask, so why should malformation of a human be the metric for deciding whether or not the right should be granted? Because I think some people would obviously challenge even the metaphysical category of being human to
Being meaningful in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think it really comes down again to like a Kantian idea, right? That what makes you a human being, what makes you a human being which is morally significant is your dignity and your autonomy. And treating you in a way which denies the fact of the dignity and autonomy is never permissible. For the Kantian argument we went through earlier. Well, you remember when we went through that the cause guard stuff?
The old
Well, we can go through it later, but yeah. But yeah, I think it really comes down to a Kantian argument. It's almost like you're denying the premise, right? Like it makes no sense for you to treat human beings like that because every time you act, you are always acting on the premise that you are trying to benefit human beings. And the only reason you care to benefit human beings is because of basic metaphysical facts about what makes human beings worthy of moral care to begin with. That they have dignity, autonomy, and so on and so forth. And so acting in a way and because dignity and autonomy cannot be summed up in a meaningful sense, we are always under an obligation to act in a way which does not deny the fact of their dignity and autonomy, even to one individual. And doing that just makes a nonsense of our attempts to care about consequences. You can't care about consequences while at the same time saying you don't care about dignity and autonomy. It's like the gist of the intuition which underlies these sorts of claims. I mean, they're much more abstract political theory, political philosophy arguments of why these things ought to be absolute, but I don't think most of them are that persuasive in debates. Like, I don't think you could really make a proper Rawlsian argument in a debate. So I think the Kantian argument is probably the simplest one. So cool. Yeah, so arguing for rights, right? How can you go about doing that? So the first way is just to use analysis, right? Which is very hard to do because you need to be very rigorous and very careful and really walk the judge through these steps. But suppose, for instance, okay, let's take a case study. What's a right which is quite hard to prove is a right? Privacy. Okay, right, suppose this is a debate about mass surveillance, and you are opening gov, and you want to say that you're not trying to prove it's fundamental, right? But you're trying to prove that privacy is a really important, intrinsically important part about human beings, and that we need to have really strong reasons for violating people's privacy en masse. What would you say to say that privacy is important? I think privacy is a good example because it's actually quite hard to think about why you care about privacy. And it doesn't matter, you can make consequential arguments as well.
I think it's true that in science that without privacy we will eventually go insane, so therefore based on logic it's quite reasonable that we need privacy.
So have there been experiments done on this?
I think so, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I totally might be stuff like that out there because look at the Milgram experiment and all that stuff. Not the Milgram experiment, like the Stanford prisoners experiment and all that kind of stuff. I'm pretty sure someone has done some sick, twisted experiment where you locked someone up and looked at them and they went insane. That sounds very plausible to me. And if you can cite that, and actually when you cite studies, by the way, it's very helpful in debates not to cite a study, but cite it almost as if it's obvious and everyone should know about it, right? And then you look more credible. Like, you don't say, for example, I'll get to you just now. You don't say for example, we know that there have been some studies where they did this and people have actually had to say. You say obviously the classic example was 1977, right? What happened in Stanford? They did this and people went insane. This is not a minor benefit. We're talking about here. And so you go, okay, I should know about that, I guess. I'm gonna write that down. Debate's only partially about being intellectually honest. Yeah, so Colin,
also, maybe you take a fundamental right, for example, autonomy is discussed before, and explain why violating the right, like privacy, may undermine that. So you could talk about, an optoconic analysis that when you're being surveilled, you can't act in a way that's free or fair,
Yeah.
it's going to be your own intentions, and therefore you don't have autonomy, and therefore you aren't human.
Yeah, I think that's one of the good arguments you can use to sort of big out the right of privacy, right? You say that all of us have different sides of our personalities. Every human being has multiple identities, and these multiple identities are actually crucial for us to live a meaningful life. Right? We need to present different sides of ourselves to different groups of people. We need to be aware that we are in control of the facts about our life and how they're being used. And the moment someone surveils us, those boundaries are destroyed. It becomes impossible for us to keep private those parts of ourselves we want to remain private. It becomes very difficult for us to differentiate between different parts of ourselves we want to make clear to society. And because part of what it means to be a dignified individual living a fulfilled life is interacting with human beings around you in a way in which you have some degree of meaningful control, right to privacy is really important. Another, yeah.
How do you link them to like property rights? The same way that I have the right to own where I live and have some control of it. I have the right to own my information.
So I think the analogy probably works. The problem is that the right to which you are analogizing is insufficiently powerful, right? The property right is not a powerful right because we are taxed, right? So as I said, like the thing about analogies, you really need to analogize to something powerful. Don't analogize to something which is just a bit stronger than what you're debating in the first place, right? Don't say, this debate is exactly like this other debate. And the judge goes, sure, but both of those debates are equally contentious, right? You need to analogize to something powerful and at least something you can prove to be non-contentious, right? And that makes the analogy do a bit more work. But yeah, so you can, I think you can use analysis to do it. I think that's one example of how you could do it. Again, you could just make a Kantian argument, right? If you're saying you have an absolute right to freedom from torture, you would just straightforwardly make the Kantian argument. So that's like a simple example of how you go about doing that. Okay, second example. Analogies, examples, rhetoric. Hello. I'm gonna find a seat. Sorry. Oh, by the way, when you're arguing for like rights in the abstract, it's often helpful to sort of just like shove in some obvious like bad outcomes if you don't give people these rights. So for instance, if I'm going to prove a right to privacy, obviously you would raise the specter of like oppressive societies where governments use that information to do screwed up stuff to you, right? Even if that's not the paradigm case, right? You'll say things like, look, if you're a gay person living in an incredibly homophobic society, like what's necessary privacy for people in liberal societies to live a dignified life might just be what's necessary for you to be alive at all, right? So these things can really fundamentally matter to people, right? So just put that stuff in there as well. Never really hurts. Okay, cool. Analogies, right? So yeah, you talked about the Marxist revolution example. So like when in one of the rounds of LSE Open, so Shu and I ended up being in a debate which was this house believes that violence is a legitimate response to poverty, right? And we were on the closing government team. So the opening government team, I think, made like a bunch of really good persuasive arguments about why using violence to respond to state neglect and poverty will compel states to do things, why even if there's extensive property damage, it will be justified in the long term, stuff like that. And of course the opening opposition says, but like the world will just burn, you know, the poor are systematically disadvantaged, the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, so everyone's just gonna die, right? So we spent like 10 probably of our 15 minutes in prep just trying to come up with a good analogy to show that like people have an absolute right to do this. So the first thing we did, and this is like the analysis bit, is to show that property rights really are just violence, right? And I think this is one of the most fun and brilliant things I've actually seen anyone do in a debate. But the way Sheng proved it was that he walked over to one of the speakers, who shall remain unnamed, and sort of took his phone, much to his annoyance, started waving the phone around saying like, this is X's person's phone. This person has a property right to it. If I take this phone and I keep walking down the street, eventually this phone is going to end up in this other person's hands. Not because the property right magically asserts itself. It's because an agent of the state is going to walk up to me, knock me down, rip this phone out of my hands, and give it to you. And underlying every single property right in existence is this implied threat of violence, right? And just as someone putting a gun to your head and saying your money or your life is violence, even if you don't press the trigger, this implied threat is real violence, right? So he said this is not structural violence, this is not metaphorical violence, it's just violence. So having proven that property rights are violence, the next step is to show that you have an absolute right of self-defense against the violence which is property rights. And this is what we spend most of the time in prep thinking of. And eventually we came up with an analogy which we thought sort of proved the point. I think this is a good example because it shows you how analogies need to be carefully selected and worked through, and sometimes you might need, especially for an extension, just devote all of your time to finding that one example which works. An analogy we found was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's quite a good example because basically it's been quite well documented by most historians that the Jews who rose up against the Nazis knew that they were very unlikely to succeed, right? And in fact, this guy called Marek Edelman, who was one of the commanders of the left-wing Jewish group which organized this resistance, actually said like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was just a way for us to choose time and means of our death. Okay? They were actually quite explicit about this, right? So having chosen an example, you can't just say it, right? You can't just say, but oh, like just as how it was okay for the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto to rise up even though they were all going to die. The other side can say, but maybe they shouldn't have because they died, right? Like, so eventually, I can't remember the exact words, but we eventually wordsmithed it into a POI, which I'm not sure we actually managed to give, but it basically said, when the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against the Nazis, they knew they weren't going to win. They knew they were probably going to lose. But does it lie in your mouth to have told the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto to have gone quietly into the night? Right? That was the phrasing we used. Right? When you phrase it that way, it becomes a lot harder for someone to go, yeah, no, these irrational Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto being subject to genocide, like, you know, they should have been a bit calmer about the situation, right? It sounds horrific, right? Actually, we did manage to give him the POI. Because I recall that the response was, look, I just don't think poverty is like genocide. To which Shengwu's response was, so if you put someone in a place and kill them because of their race, then you can rise up. If you put someone in a place and kill them because they're poor, you can't rise up. You know? But my point is, you know, you need to think hard about finding the right example and really work it into something which actually does the necessary analytic work, right? And I think part of this is just daring to try this out in prep, right? Or we go for tournament, because it is just a very scary thing to say, we're not going to think of standard arguments, we're going to put all of our eggs in this big non-consequentialist basket, and we are going to think of like that one perfect example to which they will not have a good response. And then on the basis of that, just come up and say, so what if the world burns? Like, sure, the world's going to burn, right? But you know, because of the world unite, all that jazz. So I think analogies can be very helpful for that as well. Another, I think, phenomenal example is Will Jones's speech in the abortion final, which he won, right? Anyone here is not familiar with that speech? Okay, sorry. Let's go back to the video. Who here is familiar with that speech? Okay, so everyone who's not familiar with that speech, you should really go watch it, because like, it's interrupted like 8 times by standing ovations as I'm because like the rhetoric and use of language is really powerful. And so the debate was basically this house would ban abortion at all stages of pregnancy, and opening off one basically by conceding that the fetus was alive and that killing a fetus was murder. But they said because of the fetus's, I think the exact words were vicious psychological assault on the mother is entitled to defend herself against the fetus, and the only way a mother can defend herself against a fetus is to murder it. So we would murder it. And when the other side gave a POI saying, but aren't you neglecting, because the other side talked about many harms to the mother, of course, and the other side gave a POI saying, aren't you neglecting the fetus's right to life? Why wouldn't you prosecute someone for violating the fetus's right to life? And the response was just, for the exact same way the government does not prosecute you if you murder someone in self-defense, if you have no other option. And then, like, I think the debate was kind of won at that point, really, right? I mean, no one actually came back to that response. So you know what I said at the beginning, the nice thing about principled arguments is that if you manage to actually make them, you get to ignore almost everything the other side is saying. And you get to sound kind of angry and upright and smug while doing so. Like, you know, go for it, it's fun, right? So cool, are we all clear so far? Any questions about these examples so far? Okay, okay, and then there's like 2 cheats. Now, I told you that rights are anti-utilitarian, right? Rights are about saying to the government, you shall not do this to me under any circumstances. But, you know, again, debate's not intellectually honest. It's a game, and some of the rules let you be intellectually dishonest. So you can always just say that a right exists, because if we all acted as if this right existed, we'd all be a lot happier, right? So a lot of the civil or political rights we argue for, like the right to freedom of speech, we justify on the basis that, you know, if we have free and fair exchange of ideas, the best ideas are bubbled to the top, the government will adopt those ideas until we get better government in the long term. Hence, the right to free speech is really important. Like, no judge is going to say that's a bad argument for a right. It's quite a straightforward utilitarian one. A slightly prettier way of going about it is to use this thing called rule utilitarianism. And it's especially useful when you're trying to establish absolute rules, while at the same time conceding that there are individual circumstances where violating that rule might be a morally good idea. I think maybe it's just easiest for me to do this by working through an actual example. Like, say you're arguing against saying there's absolute right to freedom from torture. The government should never torture people, right? And the other side gives you a thought experiment. They say, you know, if someone has buried like a nuclear bomb under a major metropolitan city, and you know that if you torture this person, or more intelligently torture their loved ones, the person will tell you, because, you know, torturing loved ones is more effective than torturing a person. If we torture their loved ones, the person will tell us where the nuke is hidden, and we will save 1 million lives. Are you seriously telling me you would let 1 million people die in a cataclysmic explosion, and millions of others die slowly of radiation sickness, when you could just torture this one guy and do it? Are you seriously telling me this is not okay morally? Right? What's your response? The rule utilitarian response is to say, sure, we concede that there might be one-off scenarios where this is a good idea. But the moment you cross that line, you are going to permit the government to use torture in many other scenarios which are not the scenario you just told me. And not only are you permitting the government to do that, every single instance where the government does that in the future will broaden the government's prerogative to do so in an unjustified way. So over the long term, actually, torture might be individually utile, but over the long term, it's always disutile. And so we ought to enshrine as an absolute right, a right to freedom from torture. Are we all clear on what this argument means, right? So you are basically saying that there's a reason we need to have rules. And if you think about it, this is just a slippery slope argument, right? It's also a good slippery slope argument, which distinguishes it from many other slippery slope arguments. But you need to, if you're going to do rule utilitarianism, you need to actually do the work, right? How do judges work? How does the legal system set precedents? How is it that during times of moral panic, the political system leans in favor of individuals who are seen as men or women of action, who are able to do something? How is it that during times of moral panic, we default to otherizing metrics like race or religion, which makes the people we torture to be uniquely viewed as subjects who aren't even human to begin with, right? But you need to say all these things to make the rule utilitarian argument work. But if you make it work, again, this is one of those arguments that's incredibly hard to rebut. Like the track record of government when it comes to torturing people in circumstances where they obviously should not have done so is just atrocious, right? Are we all clear on what this, how rule utilitarianism works, right? Okay, so far, any questions? Any questions so far? Okay. Democracy, while you have it. Actually, it's 8:25. We're about halfway through. Hopefully you're not too exhausted. Should we take a break? Okay. Oh, do people not want a break? Do you want to go on? Or do people need like a 10-minute break?
You want a 10-minute.
I could go on. I'm quite talkative. Okay, people who want break, put up your hands. People who don't want break, God. The breaks have it. So yeah, we'll go for a 10-minute break and we'll come back. By a margin of one hand.